In the forgotten corners of the world, where pack law rules with iron claws and bloodlines determine destiny, there are those who exist in the spaces between, neither fully accepted nor entirely cast out, surviving on the scraps of a society that has no place for the broken. Lyra Ashwind was such a creature. At 23, she had learned to make herself small, to move through her days like morning mist, present but unnoticed, necessary but unloved. The Omega who gathered herbs while others slept, who mended what was torn while others celebrated what was whole, who understood intimately that in a world where strength was currency, gentleness was a luxury few could afford to possess. She had made peace with invisibility, or so she told herself during the long nights when the pack's howls echoed through the forest, and she remained silent, knowing her voice would not be missed in their ancient songs. Love was for those born to receive it. Purpose was for those whose bloodlines carried weight. And dreams. Dreams were dangerous things that led only to the kind of heartbreak that left permanent scars. But on the morning when fate would shatter her careful solitude, when a dying child's blood would mingle with her own and bind her to a destiny she never sought, Lyra would discover that sometimes the very qualities that make you invisible to the world are the ones that make you essential to it. Sometimes salvation wears the face of a broken wolf pup left to die alone. Sometimes courage is found not in those who were born to fight, but in those who choose to love when loving costs everything they have. And sometimes, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, a single act of compassion can reshape the fate of kingdoms. This is the story of blood freely given, of bonds forged in desperation, and of a woman who learned that true nobility has nothing to do with the name you're born with, and everything to do with the choices you make when no one is watching. This is the story of how the forgotten become unforgettable, and how love, in all its forms, remains the most powerful magic of all. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The scent of iron and death hung heavy in the air when Lyra found the pup. She had ventured out to gather medicinal herbs at the forest's edge, as she did every morning before the rest of the pack stirred. It was safer that way. Fewer contemptuous stares, fewer venomous whispers about the worthless Omega, who couldn't even find a mate. The early morning mist clung to the ancient trees like ghostly fingers, and the forest seemed unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. Lyra's bare feet made no sound on the moss-covered ground as she moved between the towering oaks and silver birches, her worn wicker basket slowly filling with moonwort and healing sage. At 23, she had grown accustomed to solitude, to the way pack members' conversations died when she approached, to the deliberate distance they maintained as if her mere presence might somehow contaminate them. The rejection still stung, even after all these years. As an Omega without a mate, without family, without any apparent value to the pack's strength or future, she existed on the very edges of their society. Her small cottage sat apart from the main village. Her meals came from scraps and whatever she could forage, and her only companions were the woodland creatures who didn't care about pack hierarchy or bloodline purity. It was the silence that first alerted her that something was wrong. The normal symphony of forest sounds, birds calling, insects humming, small animals rustling through the underbrush, had ceased entirely. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving an unnatural stillness that made her wolf instincts prickle with unease. That's when she caught the scent. Beneath the familiar earthy aromas of moss and wildflowers lay something else, the metallic tang of fresh blood, mixed with something darker, more sinister, something that made her stomach clench with dread. Following her nose, Lyra pushed through a dense thicket of thorn bushes, ignoring the way the barbs caught at her simple brown dress and scratched her arms. The scent grew stronger with each step, leading her to a small clearing she had never noticed before, hidden deep in the heart of the ancient wood. The pup lay among the gnarled roots of an enormous oak tree, so still that she almost mistook it for a pile of dark leaves scattered by some long-ago storm. Almost. Until she caught the barely perceptible movement of its chest rising and falling in labored, desperate breaths. "Oh, sweet goddess," Lyra breathed, dropping her basket and rushing forward. The pup was unlike any she had ever seen. Larger than normal for its apparent age, it possessed midnight black fur that seemed to absorb the filtered morning light, and distinctive golden markings on its paws that gleamed with an almost metallic sheen. But it was the wounds that made bile rise in Lyra's throat. Deep, precise cuts along its flank and legs, as if someone had tried to methodically carve it apart with razor-sharp claws. The edges of each wound were tinged with an unnatural blue-black color that spoke of poison, of deliberate cruelty designed not just to kill, but to cause maximum suffering. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and rage. As she knelt beside the broken creature, other details became apparent. The pup's fur, where it wasn't matted with blood, was of exceptional quality, thick and lustrous in a way that suggested noble breeding. Its bone structure, even beneath the damage, spoke of strength and size that would be impressive when fully grown. But most disturbing of all was the scent that clung to its small form. Not just the iron of blood and the bitter tang of poison, but something else. Something powerful and foreign that made her inner wolf pace nervously, torn between submission and protectiveness. Lyra glanced around the clearing, searching for any sign of the pup's attackers or its pack. The ground was churned with signs of struggle, but the scents were too muddled by blood and strange magic to make sense of them. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent and deliberate. Someone had wanted this pup to die slowly and painfully, alone in the wilderness. The thought sent a surge of protective fury through her chest. She knew too well what it felt like to be abandoned, to suffer while others looked away. The echo of her own childhood, cold nights when no adult cared if she ate, cruel laughter when she stumbled during pack exercises, the crushing loneliness of growing up unwanted, rose unbidden in her memory. The pup let out a weak whimper, barely audible, and Lyra's heart clenched. She had made that same sound countless times as a child, curled alone in her corner of the communal den, while other pups slept warm against their parents. No creature should have to die alone and afraid, least of all one so young. Without hesitation, she gathered the pup into her arms, feeling its nearly lifeless weight against her chest. It was heavier than expected, with a density that suggested hidden strength, and there was something about holding it, a strange tingling sensation where their skin touched, that made her realize this was no ordinary forest wolf. But it didn't matter. Noble-born or common, magical or mundane, the pup was dying, and she couldn't simply walk away. The journey back to the village felt interminable. With each step, Lyra felt the pup growing weaker in her arms, its breathing becoming increasingly shallow and irregular. Blood from its wounds seeped through her dress, staining the rough brown fabric dark crimson, but she pressed on, murmuring words of comfort that probably meant nothing to the unconscious creature, but helped steady her own fraying nerves. The Ashwind Pack village sprawled across a natural valley, its timber and stone buildings arranged in careful circles around the Alpha's imposing manor house. The outer rings housed the lower-ranked pack members, Betas, Gammas, and the handful of Omegas who had managed to secure mates, and therefore some measure of acceptance. Lyra's own cottage sat far beyond even these humble dwellings, isolated at the tree line where the village met the wild forest. As she hurried through the empty morning streets, her destination was clear: the healer's cottage near the village center. Mira Thornfield was the pack's only trained healer, a stern woman in her 50s who had studied the healing arts in the great city packs before returning home to serve Ashwind. She was known for her skill and her sharp tongue in equal measure, but surely, faced with a dying pup, she would put aside any personal feelings about Lyra's status. The healer's cottage was easy to identify, painted deep forest green with protective herbs hanging in aromatic bundles along the eaves. Wolfsbane, mountain ash, and blessed thistle created a barrier against malevolent magic, while garden plots overflowing with medicinal plants spoke of serious dedication to the healing arts. The windows were lit with warm yellow lamplight, and smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that Mira was already awake and likely preparing her daily tinctures and remedies. Lyra pounded on the solid oak door with her free hand, her heart racing as she felt the pup's breathing become even more labored against her chest. "Healer Thornfield, please, I need help." Footsteps approached from within, measured, unhurried, speaking of someone accustomed to medical emergencies but not easily flustered. The door opened to reveal Mira's sharp-featured face, her steel-gray hair pulled back in its customary severe bun. Her pale blue eyes took in Lyra's appearance with obvious distaste. The blood-stained dress, the desperate expression, the way she clutched something protectively against her chest. "What do you want, Omega?" Mira's voice carried the familiar edge of disdain that Lyra had grown to expect from most pack members. "Please," Lyra gasped, exhaustion and fear making her voice crack. I found this pup in the forest. He's dying. Someone poisoned him, tortured him. He needs immediate medical attention, or he won't survive the hour. She held out the bundle in her arms, pulling back the edge of her bloodied shawl to reveal the pup's still form. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker across Mira's face. Professional interest, perhaps even sympathy. But then the healer's expression changed dramatically. Mira's nostrils flared as she caught the scent emanating from the small creature. Her face went pale, then flushed with what looked unmistakably like fear. She stepped back from her doorway, as if Lyra carried some infectious disease. No, the rejection was swift and final, delivered with a finality that brooked no argument. I won't touch that thing. What? Why not? Lyra's voice rose with desperation. He's just a pup. He's dying. That, Mira said, pointing a trembling finger at the bundle in Lyra's arms, is no ordinary pup. Her voice dropped to a harsh whisper. Can't you smell it? The power radiating from him? The foreign magic clinging to his fur like a shroud? That creature carries the scent of the royal bloodline. Lyra blinked in confusion. Royal bloodline? What does that mean? It means, Mira continued, her fear now openly visible, that whatever that thing is, wherever it came from, it's connected to powers far beyond our simple pack. It reeks of the capital, of the great fortress packs that rule from the northern mountains. I won't risk bringing that kind of attention, that kind of trouble, to our people. But he's innocent, Lyra protested, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. He didn't choose to be born into whatever bloodline you think he represents. He's hurt, and dying, and alone. Mira's expression hardened further. The royal bloodline brings nothing but death and domination wherever it goes. Their wars, their politics, their endless hunger for power, it destroys everything it touches. If that pup lives, if word spreads that we harbored him, do you think the Alpha King will simply thank us and leave us in peace? She shook her head violently. We'll be drawn into conflicts we can't survive, made pawns in games we don't understand. So you'll just let an innocent child die? Lyra's voice was thick with disgust. Better one death now than the destruction of our entire pack later, Mira replied coldly. That's the kind of harsh calculation that keeps people alive in this world, Omega. Perhaps if you had ever been responsible for anyone other than yourself, you might understand. The accusation hit like a physical blow, but Lyra refused to back down. I understand perfectly. I understand that you're a coward who would rather let a child suffer than risk your own comfort. Mira's face twisted with anger. How dare you? I dare because someone has to, Lyra snapped. Because someone has to care about the innocent and helpless, even when it's inconvenient. For a moment, the two women stared at each other across the threshold, the dying pup's labored breathing the only sound in the tense silence. Then Mira's expression grew colder than winter frost. Find someone else to enable your foolish martyrdom, she said, and slammed the door shut with a resounding bang. Lyra stood there for several heartbeats, stunned by the callous rejection. Behind the closed door, she could hear Mira moving around, deliberately making noise to emphasize that the conversation was over. The pup whimpered again in her arms, weaker than before, and she felt his small body growing even more limp against her chest. No, she wouldn't let him die. Not like this. Not alone and abandoned as she had been so many times. Racing through the village streets with renewed determination, Lyra headed for her cottage at the settlement's edge. Her small home was humble. Just 2 rooms with a stone hearth, wooden furniture that had seen better days, and windows that didn't quite keep out the winter wind, but it was clean and private, and most importantly, it was hers. She burst through the front door and laid the pup gently on her narrow bed, the only piece of furniture soft enough for his broken body. Up close, in the lamplight, his condition looked even worse than she had feared. His breathing was so shallow that she had to strain to see the rise and fall of his tiny chest, and his skin beneath the dark fur felt cold to the touch, never a good sign in a warm-blooded creature. Lyra had basic healing supplies accumulated over years of treating her own injuries when the pack healer refused her services. Dried herbs hung in bundles from her ceiling beams, and her small cupboard held salves and tinctures that she had learned to make through trial and error. But nothing in her amateur collection would work against the kind of exotic poison coursing through the pup's veins, nothing powerful enough to draw back a life that had already traveled so far toward death's door. Unless, staring down at the dying creature, an impossible idea began to form in her mind. She had heard whispered stories in her childhood, fragments of ancient lore shared by the pack's eldest members when they thought no young ears were listening. Tales of the old times, when desperate wolves would share their very life force through blood to save those they loved. It was considered primitive magic now, dangerous and unpredictable. Blood bonds were sacred, meant only for the most intimate relationships, mates pledging their lives to each other, parents saving their children in dire emergencies. The practice had been largely abandoned centuries ago when more sophisticated healing arts developed. Modern healers could accomplish the same results with less risk using carefully prepared medicines and controlled magical procedures. Blood sharing was now seen as the desperate resort of ignorant wolves who didn't understand the potential consequences. But what choice did she have? Every second that passed, the pup grew weaker. His breathing had become so irregular that she feared each exhale might be his last. The poison was winning its battle against his small body's defenses, and without intervention, he would be dead within the hour. The pup's breathing hitched painfully, and Lyra made her decision. Moving with sudden purpose, she retrieved a small, sharp knife from her kitchen drawer, the same blade she used to harvest herbs and prepare her simple meals. Her hands shook as she held it up to the lamplight, but her resolve was firm and unshakable. She had been abandoned and ignored her entire life, forced to watch others receive the care and protection that should have been everyone's birthright. She would not perpetuate that cycle of cruelty, no matter the personal cost. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the pup, though she wasn't entirely sure whether she was apologizing for what she was about to do, or for the world that had brought them both to this desperate moment. "I don't know if this will work, but I have to try. You don't deserve to die alone." Without allowing herself time to reconsider, Lyra drew the blade across her left palm in one swift motion. Pain flared sharp and immediate as blood welled up from the clean cut, bright scarlet against her pale skin. The sight made her briefly dizzy. She had never been comfortable with blood, even her own, but she pushed through the queasiness and moved quickly before she lost her nerve. Kneeling beside the bed, she pressed her bleeding palm against the pup's muzzle, feeling the sticky warmth of her blood against his cold nose and lips. "Please," she breathed, closing her eyes and pouring every ounce of hope and desperate love she possessed into the words. "Please let this work. Please let him live." For a terrifying moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nothing happened. The pup remained motionless beneath her touch, his breathing still dangerously weak and irregular. Lyra began to fear that she had waited too long, that whatever ancient magic might once have flowed through such rituals had been lost to the modern world. Then, as if responding to some primal instinct buried deeper than conscious thought, the pup's small pink tongue darted out to lap at the blood on her palm. The effect was immediate and completely unexpected. A warm golden light erupted from the point where their blood touched, spreading across the pup's small form like liquid sunlight, given physical substance. The illumination was so bright that Lyra had to squint, but she couldn't bring herself to look away as the miracle unfolded before her eyes. The wounds along the pup's flank began to close with supernatural speed, poisoned flesh healing and regenerating as if time itself were reversing. The sickly blue-black tinge faded from the injured areas, replaced by healthy pink skin beneath glossy black fur. Even more remarkable, she could see his breathing deepening and strengthening with each passing second, his body temperature rising as vitality flowed back into his small frame. But the healing was only part of what was happening. Lyra felt something much deeper occurring, a connection forming between them that transcended anything she had ever experienced. It was as if invisible threads were weaving themselves between their souls, binding them together in ways that she instinctively knew were permanent and profound. Through this strange new link, she could sense the pup's pain diminishing moment by moment, his strength returning like sunrise after the darkest night. But she could also feel something of his essential nature, his intelligence, his spirit, his very identity, flowing into her awareness. There were flashes of memory that weren't her own. Stone corridors lit by torches, the scent of power and authority, voices calling commands in languages she didn't recognize. Most shocking of all was the overwhelming sense of nobility that radiated from the small creature. This was no ordinary forest wolf, no abandoned pup left to die by uncaring parents. This was someone important, someone whose very existence might reshape the world around them both. When the golden light finally began to fade, Lyra found herself staring down at a completely transformed creature. The pup's fur now gleamed with health and vitality, his wounds completely healed without even the faintest scar to mark where they had been. His breathing was strong and regular, his body warm and full of life. But it was his eyes that truly took her breath away as they opened to meet her gaze. Brilliant golden orbs that held an intelligence far beyond his apparent age. They were ancient eyes, knowing eyes that had seen and understood things that would remain mysteries to most wolves throughout their entire lives. "Hello, little one," Lyra whispered, exhaustion from the blood-sharing making her voice weak and tremulous. The pup, no longer dying, no longer broken, sat up slowly and regarded her with those extraordinary golden eyes. There was recognition there, gratitude, but also something deeper, something that spoke of destiny and fate, and the invisible forces that sometimes brought souls together across impossible circumstances. When he opened his mouth, instead of the bark or whimper she expected, a single word emerged in a voice far too mature and articulate for his size. "Mother." Lyra's blood ran cold as the implications crashed over her like a freezing wave. Pups couldn't speak. Not like this, with such clarity and adult comprehension. The ability to communicate in human language didn't typically manifest until wolves reached adolescence, and even then it required years of training and practice. What kind of creature had she saved? What had she unknowingly bound herself to through the ancient ritual of blood-sharing? Before she could begin to process the enormity of what had just occurred, a sound erupted from the depths of the forest that made her entire cottage tremble. It started as a single howl, deep, primal, carrying an authority that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But it was quickly joined by others. Dozens of powerful voices raised in perfect harmony, creating a symphony of dominance that spoke of vast numbers and unimaginable strength. This wasn't the familiar sound of her own pack's evening song, or even the calls of neighboring territories marking their boundaries. This was something far more ancient and terrible, the voice of true royalty announcing its presence to a world that would bow or burn. The pup's ears perked up at the sound, and he padded to the window with surprising steadiness for one who had been near death moments before. Pressing his small nose against the glass, he gazed out into the darkness with those golden eyes that seemed to hold all the secrets of the universe. "They're coming," he said simply, his childish voice carrying an odd note of satisfaction mixed with something that might have been relief. "Father is coming for me." Outside, the howling grew closer and more intense, accompanied now by other sounds that made Lyra's soul quake with terror. The thunder of countless paws striking the earth in perfect synchronization, the ring of metal against metal that spoke of armor and weapons, the barely controlled power of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of wolves moving with military precision through the night. Most terrifying of all was the underlying scent that began to drift through her windows. Dominance so pure and concentrated that it made her knees weak, authority so absolute that every instinct screamed at her to submit before she had even seen its source. Through their new blood bond, she felt the pup's emotions, anticipation, joy, and something that might have been vindication. Whatever forces were approaching through the forest, he welcomed them. They were his people, his family, coming to reclaim what had been stolen. And she, Lyra Ashwind, the unwanted Omega, who had acted on nothing more than compassion and instinct, was about to meet them. As the sounds of the approaching army grew louder, Lyra realized with crystal clarity that her life as she had known it was over. Whatever she had done by saving this extraordinary pup, whatever lines she had crossed and laws she had broken, the consequences were about to arrive at her doorstep with the force of an avalanche. She could only pray that mercy might be found in the heart of whoever ruled these creatures of the night, because somehow, deep in her bones, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The ground trembled beneath the weight of their approach. Lyra pressed herself against the window beside the pup, who had given her his name as Prince Kieran during the tense hour they had waited, watching in terrified fascination as torches began to appear through the trees. Not dozens, as she had first estimated, but hundreds. A river of flame flowing through the darkness, accompanied by the rhythmic thunder of paws and boots that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. "How many?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was asking Kieran or herself. "Father doesn't travel lightly," the young prince replied, his golden eyes reflecting the approaching torchlight. Despite his apparent youth, his voice carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to vast displays of power. 500 of the royal guard, at minimum, perhaps more. depending on how seriously he's taking the threat to my life. 500. Lyra's legs nearly gave out at the number. Her entire pack consisted of barely 60 wolves, including children and elders. The force approaching through the forest could crush them without even slowing down. "What will they do to my people?" she asked, dreading the answer. Kieran glanced up at her, and for a moment his ancient eyes softened with something that might have been sympathy. "That depends entirely on how cooperative your alpha chooses to be, and on what my father decides about you." Before Lyra could ask what that meant, a new sound reached them, the deep, resonant note of a war horn echoing through the valley. It was answered immediately by similar calls from multiple directions, the coordinated signals of a military force taking strategic positions around their target. Within minutes, the Ashwin Pack village was completely surrounded. Through her window, Lyra could see pack members emerging from their homes in various states of dress and panic. Alpha Marcus Ashwind himself appeared on the steps of his manor house, hastily dressed but carrying himself with the dignity his position demanded. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself, as he surveyed the overwhelming force that had materialized around his territory. "I should go to them," Lyra said, starting toward her door. "If this is about me, about what I did, then I should—" "No." Kieran's voice carried a command that stopped her mid-step, despite coming from such a small form. "You stay here, with me, until my father arrives." There was something in his tone, an expectation of obedience that seemed to bypass her conscious mind and speak directly to her wolf instincts. That made arguing impossible. Instead, she found herself returning to the window, drawn by a compulsion she didn't entirely understand. The wait felt interminable, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes before a new group separated itself from the larger force. This was clearly the command unit, a dozen wolves in both human and shifted forms, moving with the predatory grace of creatures who had never known defeat. At their head walked a figure that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. Even in human form, Alpha King Alden Nightwarden was unmistakably what he was: apex predator, ultimate authority, the living embodiment of everything that made wolves bow their heads in submission. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of incredible physical power, and moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never encountered anything he couldn't dominate or destroy. His hair was black as midnight, shot through with silver threads that caught the torchlight, and his skin bore the pale complexion of the northern mountain packs. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as royalty, the same brilliant gold as his son's, but older, colder, carrying the weight of absolute authority, and the kind of patience that came from knowing the entire world would wait for your pleasure. He wore simple traveling clothes rather than formal regalia, but somehow that made him even more intimidating. This was power so secure in itself that it needed no outward display, authority so absolute that it could afford to dress modestly while commanding armies. "He's beautiful," Lyra breathed before she could stop herself, then immediately flushed with embarrassment at the admission. Beside her, Kieran made a sound that might have been amusement. "All the court ladies think so. Half the noble families in the kingdom have offered daughters in marriage alliances, hoping to bind themselves to the royal bloodline. Is he married?" The question slipped out before Lyra could consider whether it was appropriate to ask. "No." Kieran's voice carried an odd note of sadness. "Mother died bringing me into the world. Father has never shown interest in taking another mate, despite the pressure from his advisors. They say he loved her too much to replace her." The weight of that information settled over Lyra like a blanket. The most powerful alpha in the known world, ruling alone, raising his heir without a partner to share the burden. It painted a picture of isolation that she recognized all too well, even if the circumstances were vastly different from her own. Outside, King Alden had reached the village center and was speaking quietly with Alpha Marcus. Even without being able to hear the words, Lyra could read the body language, her pack leader's carefully respectful posture, the slight bow of his head that acknowledged the vast difference in their status, the way he gestured occasionally toward the forest edge where her cottage sat. "He's asking about me," she said with certainty. "Of course he is." Kieran left the window and padded to her small hearth, settling himself on the worn rug with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being comfortable anywhere. "You saved the heir to the Northern Crown. That makes you either the most valuable person in this village or the most dangerous, depending on his perspective." Dangerous? How could I possibly be dangerous to someone like him? Before Kieran could answer, 3 sharp knocks echoed from her front door. Not the frantic pounding of emergency, but the measured rhythm of someone accustomed to having their summons answered immediately. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the door, every instinct screaming at her to run, even as she knew there was nowhere to go. With trembling hands, she lifted the wooden latch and pulled the door open. King Alden Nightwarden stood on her threshold, flanked by 2 guards whose presence somehow seemed less intimidating than his overwhelming personal authority. Up close, he was even more imposing, not just his physical size, but the sheer force of personality that radiated from him like heat from a forge. His golden eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Lyra Ashwind," he said, and somehow hearing her name in that deep, resonant voice made her knees weak. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Your Majesty," she managed, dropping into the best curtsy she could manage while standing in her doorway. Yes. He's inside. I've been caring for him." The king's eyes never left her face, but she saw something flicker across his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or assessment. "Caring for him. Yes, I can smell that you have been." His nostrils flared slightly. "In fact, I can smell a great deal more than simple care." Heat flooded Lyra's cheeks as she realized what he meant. The blood bond she had formed with Kieran would be obvious to someone with his sensitivity to magical signatures. There would be no hiding what she had done, no pretending it had been anything less than the ancient ritual it was. "May I enter?" The question was phrased politely, but they both knew it wasn't really a request. Kings didn't ask permission from Omegas, they simply took what they required. Lyra stepped aside, gesturing him into her humble cottage. The small space seemed to shrink around his presence, her simple furniture and modest belongings appearing even shabbier in contrast to his natural magnificence. But if he noticed the poverty of his surroundings, he gave no sign. "Kieran," he called softly, and the young prince immediately appeared from beside the hearth. "Father." The reunion was quiet, but obviously meaningful. Kieran ran to his father's arms, and for a moment, the terrible authority that cloaked the king like armor seemed to soften. He gathered his son against his chest, and Lyra caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in his golden eyes. Relief, love, and the kind of desperate gratitude that came from nearly losing something irreplaceable. "I thought I had lost you," he murmured into Kieran's fur, his voice so quiet that Lyra had to strain to hear it. "The Shadowmere pack found me during the hunting expedition," Kieran said, his childish voice taking on a harder edge. "They used poisoned blades, Father. They weren't trying to capture me. They wanted me dead." King Alden's expression went cold in a way that made the temperature in the cottage seem to drop several degrees. "We will discuss the Shadowmere situation later," he said, but the promise of retribution in his voice was unmistakable. "For now, I'm simply grateful that you're alive and safe." His golden gaze shifted back to Lyra, and she felt pinned like a butterfly in a collection case. "Thanks to this young woman, who apparently risked her own life to save yours." "She gave me her blood, Father," Kieran said, and there was pride in his voice that made Lyra's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "When the healer refused to help, when everyone else turned away, she cut her own hand and shared her life force with me. She brought me back from the edge of death." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. King Alden stared at Lyra with an expression she couldn't begin to interpret. Shock, perhaps, or something deeper and more complex. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "You understand what you've done, don't you?" he asked. "The implications of blood sharing with a member of the royal bloodline?" Lyra's mouth went dry. I'm not sure. I just knew he was dying, and I couldn't let that happen. I didn't think about politics or consequences or anything except saving him. Something that might have been admiration flickered across the king's features. "You didn't think. You simply acted on compassion." He studied her face intently. "Tell me, Lyra Ashwind, what do you know about the old laws governing blood bonds?" "Very little, Your Majesty," she admitted. "I know they create a connection between the participants, that they're considered sacred, and not to be undertaken lightly. But beyond that," King Alden nodded slowly, "the blood bond you've created makes you, in the eyes of ancient law, a member of my family. Kieran's life is now tied to yours in ways that cannot be easily severed. You are his protector, his guardian, his—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "His pack mother, if you will. That makes you one of the most important people in my kingdom, whether you intended it or not." The implications hit Lyra like a physical blow. I never meant. I was just trying to help. I don't want to be important, or political, or anything that would disrupt your family. What you want, the king said gently, ceased to matter the moment you chose to save my son's life. You are bound to us now, as we are bound to you. The question is what we do about it. Before Lyra could respond, one of the guards who had remained outside stepped through the doorway. Your Majesty, he said urgently, Alpha Marcus requests an immediate audience. He says there are things you need to know about the woman's situation here. King Alden's expression darkened. What kind of things? He wouldn't say, sire. Only that it was urgent and related to her. Circumstances within the pack. Lyra felt her stomach drop. She could imagine exactly what Alpha Marcus wanted to discuss. Her status as an unmated Omega, her position at the bottom of the pack hierarchy, perhaps even the reasons why the healer had refused to treat Kieran. None of it would paint her in a favorable light. Very well, the king said after a moment. We'll continue this conversation shortly. Kieran, stay with Lyra. Guard her. The young prince nodded solemnly, taking his responsibilities seriously despite his apparent age. As the king turned toward the door, Lyra found herself speaking before she could think better of it. Your Majesty. Wait. He paused, looking back at her with raised eyebrows. Whatever Alpha Marcus tells you about me, please remember that I never asked to be what I am. I never chose to be packless, or mateless, or worthless in everyone's eyes. I just existed, and when I found your son, all I could think about was that no child should die alone and afraid, the way I've lived my entire life. For a long moment, King Alden stared at her, and she thought she saw something shift in his golden eyes. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. No child should die alone and afraid, he repeated quietly. No adult should live that way either. He straightened, and the moment of vulnerability passed. Wait here. We will speak again soon. As the door closed behind him, Lyra sank onto her bed, emotionally exhausted by the intensity of the encounter. Through the window, she could see the king striding toward the village center, where Alpha Marcus waited with obvious anxiety. He likes you, Kieran said suddenly from his position by the hearth. Lyra looked at the young prince in surprise. What makes you say that? Father has a particular way of speaking when he's impressed by someone. He used that tone with you just now. Kieran's golden eyes held an ancient wisdom that was startling in such a young face. He's also angry on your behalf, which is unusual. Father doesn't typically concern himself with the personal struggles of individual pack members, even noble ones. I'm hardly noble, Lyra said with a bitter laugh. You are now, Kieran replied matter-of-factly. Blood bonds with royal family members automatically elevate the other participant to noble status. You're technically a duchess, though I suppose Father will have to figure out what to do with a duchess who lives in a one-room cottage and gathers herbs for survival. The absurdity of it made Lyra laugh despite everything. A duchess? Me? She shook her head. Your father is going to realize very quickly that he's made a terrible mistake bringing me into his world. Before Kieran could respond, angry voices began to carry from the village center. Through her window, Lyra could see Alpha Marcus gesturing emphatically, while the king listened with an expression of growing displeasure. Other pack members had gathered at what they probably thought was a safe distance, their faces reflecting various combinations of curiosity, fear, and excitement at being witness to such momentous events. The conversation appeared to be growing more heated by the moment. Alpha Marcus was clearly agitated, his voice rising enough that occasional words carried across the distance. Dangerous precedent, and pack stability, and cannot be permitted. King Alden, in contrast, remained perfectly still and calm, but even from this distance, Lyra could see the way his posture conveyed barely controlled fury. When he finally responded, his voice was too quiet to carry, but whatever he said made Alpha Marcus step backward as if physically struck. This isn't going well, Lyra murmured. Kieran padded to the window beside her, pressing his nose against the glass. Father doesn't like being told what he cannot do, especially when it concerns family. As if summoned by their attention, King Alden turned toward the cottage. Even across the distance, his golden eyes found hers through the window, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. There was anger there, but also something that looked like determination, decision. He said something final to Alpha Marcus, something that made the other man bow deeply and step back in obvious submission, then began striding toward Lyra's cottage with ground-eating steps that spoke of barely contained fury. Oh no, Lyra whispered, her heart beginning to race again. What did Alpha Marcus tell him? Nothing good, obviously, Kieran replied, with the practical acceptance of someone accustomed to court politics and adult complications. But don't worry. Father's anger isn't directed at you. The 3 sharp knocks came again, but this time they carried an edge that made Lyra's hands shake as she opened the door. King Alden stood on her threshold, and the carefully controlled composure he had maintained during their first meeting had given way to something much more primal and dangerous. We're leaving, he said without preamble. Now. Tonight. Leaving? Lyra blinked in confusion. I don't understand. Your Alpha has made it clear that your continued presence in this pack would be problematic. The king's voice carried a deadly calm that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. He feels that the attention you've drawn to his territory threatens the safety and stability of his people. He has requested that I remove you from his lands permanently. The words hit Lyra like physical blows. He's banishing me, she whispered. He's trying to, King Alden corrected, and there was steel in his voice. Fortunately for you, he no longer has that authority where you're concerned. You are under royal protection now, which means decisions about your future rest with me alone. And you've decided that I should leave with you, Lyra said, trying to understand the implications. I've decided that you belong with your family, the king replied. Kieran is bound to you now, which makes you bound to us. Royal children don't live separated from their guardians, especially not guardians who have proven their loyalty through personal sacrifice. Lyra looked around her small cottage, taking in the humble possessions that represented her entire life. I don't have anything to pack. No belongings of value, no connections here that would mourn my absence. Then there's nothing keeping us, King Alden said, though his voice had gentled slightly. Unless you wish to remain, I won't force you to come with us, but I can promise that your life at the Northern Fortress will be considerably more comfortable than what you're leaving behind. The offer hung in the air between them, and Lyra realized she was standing at a crossroads that would determine the entire course of her future. Stay in a place where she had never been wanted, where she would now be resented and feared for the attention she had brought, or go into the unknown with people who were essentially strangers, no matter how noble their bloodline. She looked down at Kieran, who was watching her with those ancient golden eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. This extraordinary child who had called her mother, who was bound to her now by magic and blood, and something deeper than either. Will I be able to keep him safe? She asked the king. In your world, with your enemies and your politics, will I be able to protect him the way he needs? King Alden's expression softened, and for a moment she caught another glimpse of the man beneath the crown, someone who understood the weight of responsibility, the burden of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. We'll keep each other safe, he said quietly. All of us. That's what families do. Family. The word resonated through Lyra's chest like a bell, awakening something she had thought dead after years of rejection and isolation. Not perfect people bound together by obligation or convenience, but souls who chose to stand together against whatever darkness the world might throw at them. Then I'll come, she said, and felt something fundamental shift in her universe as she spoke the words. King Alden nodded once, sharp and decisive. Good. We leave within the hour. My people will handle any arrangements that need to be made. As he turned to go, Lyra caught his arm without thinking. The contact sent a shock through her entire body. He was incredibly warm, and the muscle beneath her fingers was like iron wrapped in silk. More than that, though, was the sudden sense of connection she felt, as if touching him had completed some circuit she hadn't known was incomplete. Thank you, she said softly, for giving me a choice, for treating me like I matter. The king's golden eyes searched her face, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You saved my son's life, Lyra Ashwind. You matter more than you could possibly imagine. Then he was gone, striding back toward his assembled forces to prepare for departure. Lyra stood in her doorway, watching him go, and realized that her heart was beating faster than it had any right to. You like him too, Kieran observed from behind her, amusement clear in his voice. Don't be ridiculous, Lyra said quickly, though she felt her cheeks burning. He's the king. I'm nobody. You're family now, Kieran corrected gently. And Father has been alone for a very long time, longer than anyone should be. Before Lyra could respond to that loaded statement, the sound of approaching horses reached them. The royal party was preparing to depart, and her old life was about to end forever. She took one last look around her cottage, trying to memorize details she thought she might miss. The way morning light fell through her eastern window, the herbs hanging from her ceiling beams, the simple furniture that had been the only stability she had ever known. Then she closed the door behind her and walked toward whatever future awaited her in the north. As they rode through the forest in the pre-dawn darkness, Lyra found herself seated on a gentle mare beside the king's massive destrier, with Kieran riding contentedly in her arms in his wolf form. The young prince had insisted on maintaining physical contact with her, claiming it helped him feel secure after his ordeal. But Lyra suspected there was more to it than simple comfort. Through their blood bond, she could sense his emotions, and right now he felt matchmaking, as if he were deliberately positioning her close to his father, engineering moments for them to interact. She tried to ignore the way King Alden's presence affected her, the butterflies in her stomach when he spoke to her, the way her skin seemed to tingle when their eyes met across the space between their horses, the protective instincts he awakened that had nothing to do with their supernatural bond, and everything to do with her growing attraction to the man beneath the crown. This was dangerous territory for someone like her. Kings didn't fall in love with rescued Omegas, no matter what fairy tales might suggest. But as they rode through the darkness toward an uncertain future, Lyra couldn't quite silence the small voice in her heart that whispered, "What if? What if the blood bond that had connected her to Kieran had also awakened something between her and his father? What if the loneliness she had seen in those golden eyes matched her own? What if saving a dying pup had been the first step toward healing more than just physical wounds?" The questions followed her into the northern wilderness, unanswered but persistent, as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, and the great fortress that would be her new home appeared on the horizon. The northern fortress rose from the mountainside like something carved from legend itself, massive stone towers that pierced the clouds, walls thick enough to withstand siege engines, and gates forged from black iron that gleamed with protective runes. As their party crested the final ridge before descent, Lyra felt her breath catch at the sheer impossibility of the structure. This wasn't just a castle. It was a declaration of power that could be seen from 50 miles in any direction. "Impressive, isn't it?" King Alden's voice carried a note of quiet pride as he guided his destrier closer to her smaller mare. "My great-grandfather began construction 2 centuries ago. Each generation has added their own improvements. It's magnificent," Lyra breathed, and meant it. But beneath her awe lay a growing anxiety. This was a place for royalty, for people born to command and rule. What place could someone like her possibly have within those ancient walls? As if sensing her thoughts, Kieran stirred in her arms, nuzzling closer to her chest with a contented sigh. "You belong here," he murmured against her neck, his voice still carrying that unsettling maturity. "The fortress needs someone who understands gentleness, as well as strength." The descent to the gates took nearly an hour, winding along roads carved into the mountain itself. As they approached, Lyra could see figures moving along the battlements, guards taking positions, servants preparing for their king's return. Word of their arrival had clearly preceded them. But it was the crowd gathered in the great courtyard that made Lyra's stomach clench with nervous anticipation. Dozens of people waited in careful formation, nobles in rich clothing, servants in livery, guards in polished armor, all of them watching with undisguised curiosity as their procession passed through the gates. "Your Majesty," a severe-looking woman in dark blue robes stepped forward as they dismounted. "Welcome home. We've prepared quarters for your guest in the South Tower." The slight pause before guest was loaded with meaning, and Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks. These people had clearly heard about her already, and their judgment was written plainly on their faces. The woman who had spoken, obviously someone in authority, looked at Lyra as if she were something distasteful that had been tracked in on someone's boot. "Lady Cordelia," King Alden's voice carried a warning that made the woman stiffen. "May I present Duchess Lyra Ashwind, guardian to Prince Kieran and honored member of the royal family. She will be staying in the royal wing, in quarters befitting her new status." Duchess. The title still sounded impossible when applied to her, but the effect on the assembled crowd was immediate and electric. The subtle expressions of disdain shifted to poorly concealed shock, then to the careful neutrality that court politics demanded when faced with an unexpected development. "Of course, Your Majesty," Lady Cordelia recovered smoothly, though Lyra caught the flash of something calculating in her pale eyes. "Forgive me. We had not been fully informed of the lady's elevation." I'll have the blue suite prepared immediately. See that you do. The king's tone brooked no argument. And have word sent to the kitchen staff. The Duchess will take her meals with the royal family, beginning this evening. As servants scurried to carry out his commands, King Alden turned to Lyra with an expression that was both apologetic and determined. I'm afraid court life takes some adjustment. People here are accustomed to clearly defined hierarchies and established bloodlines. Your sudden appearance and elevation will create interest. You mean suspicion, Lyra said quietly, watching the way various courtiers whispered among themselves while trying to appear as if they weren't staring at her. That too, he admitted, but you have advantages they don't yet understand. Kieran's protection, for one. The blood bond you share makes you untouchable by anyone who values their life. And he paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. And? Lyra prompted. And my protection as well, he said simply, which I give freely, not because protocol demands it, but because you've earned it. The weight of that statement settled over Lyra like a cloak. She was under the personal protection of the most powerful alpha in the known world, not just as a matter of law or duty, but by his own choice. It should have made her feel secure, but instead it added another layer to her growing confusion about her feelings toward him. Duchess Lyra, a new voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find a young woman approaching, perhaps 25, with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes, dressed in elegant but practical clothing that suggested both status and good sense. This is Lady Elena Ravencrest, King Alden said, and there was warmth in his voice that hadn't been present when he spoke to Lady Cordelia. My cousin and one of the few people in this fortress who can be trusted to speak honestly rather than politically. Lady Elena curtsied gracefully, but when she rose, her smile was genuine. Your Majesty is too kind. Duchess Lyra, may I say what a pleasure it is to meet the woman who saved Kieran's life. The entire fortress has been in an uproar since word arrived of his rescue. Thank you, Lyra managed, still struggling to accept that people were calling her Duchess with straight faces. I only did what anyone would have done. No, Lady Elena said seriously. You did what someone with real courage and compassion would do. There's a significant difference. She glanced meaningfully at some of the other courtiers. Not everyone here would have made the same choice, I'm afraid. Before anyone could respond to that pointed observation, Kieran wriggled in Lyra's arms and spoke up in his clear, carrying voice. Lady Elena gives the best presents. She brought me a wooden sword for my last birthday that was perfectly balanced. You remember that? Elena's face lit up with delight. You were so young, I wasn't sure you'd... She trailed off as she seemed to really take in Kieran's appearance for the first time. The way he spoke with adult clarity, the intelligence in his golden eyes, the obvious bond he shared with Lyra. Her expression shifted from casual pleasure to something approaching awe. The blood bond, she breathed. It's accelerated his development, hasn't it? Among other things, King Alden said dryly. We're still discovering all the effects. But yes, Kieran seems to have gained several years' worth of mental and emotional maturity overnight. Fascinating, Elena murmured, though she looked more intrigued than disturbed. The old magics are rarely seen anymore. To witness their effects firsthand is not a topic for public discussion, the king interrupted firmly. I trust I can count on your discretion, cousin. Of course. Elena's expression sobered. But Alden, you realize this will make things complicated? There are already whispers about the Duchess's sudden elevation. And now this. The court thrives on gossip and speculation. Let them whisper, King Alden said with a dismissive wave. They'll find more productive uses for their time soon enough. His golden eyes fixed on Lyra with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Besides, I have more important concerns than court gossip. The way he looked at her when he said that made Lyra's cheeks burn. There was something in his gaze, an interest that went beyond duty or political necessity, something that made her wonder if she was imagining the connection she felt growing between them, or if he felt it too. Perhaps, Elena said tactfully, I should escort Duchess Lyra to her quarters. I imagine she'd like time to rest and refresh herself before dinner. An excellent suggestion, the king agreed. Lyra, I'll send someone to fetch you this evening. We have much to discuss regarding your new position and Kieran's needs. As Elena led her through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, Lyra tried to process everything that had happened in the space of a few hours. This morning she had awakened in her simple cottage, expecting nothing more than another day of quiet solitude. Now she was a duchess, living in a palace, under the protection of a king who looked at her with eyes that made her forget how to breathe properly. "It's overwhelming at first," Elena said gently, apparently reading her expression. "The fortress, the titles, the way everything changes so quickly. But you'll adapt, and you have advantages most newcomers don't." "Such as?" Lyra asked. "Kieran's obvious devotion, for one. Royal children are precious beyond measure, and his attachment to you grants you a position that can't be easily challenged." Elena paused before a set of ornate double doors. "And Alden's interest, for another." "His interest?" Lyra tried to keep her voice casual. Elena smiled knowingly. "My dear Duchess, I've known Alden since childhood. I've seen him interact with countless noble ladies, foreign princesses, and ambitious courtiers. I've never seen him look at any of them the way he looked at you in that courtyard." Before Lyra could respond to that startling observation, Elena pushed open the doors to reveal the most beautiful rooms Lyra had ever seen. The Blue Suite was aptly named, decorated in various shades of sapphire and azure, with furniture that looked both expensive and comfortable. Tall windows overlooked the mountain vista, and a fire crackled welcomingly in an ornate hearth. "This is too much," Lyra said weakly. "This is yours," Elena corrected firmly. "By right of your bond with Kieran and your elevation to the royal family. Don't let anyone make you feel as though you don't deserve it." As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at the door. A servant entered carrying an armload of gowns in rich fabrics and elegant designs. "From Lady Cordelia," the girl said nervously, "for the Duchess to choose from for this evening's dinner." Elena examined the offerings with a critical eye, then made a sound of disapproval. "These won't do at all. Too formal, too obviously borrowed, and the colors are all wrong for Lyra's complexion." She turned to the servant. "Send them back to Lady Cordelia with my compliments, and inform her that I'll be handling the Duchess's wardrobe personally." After the confused servant departed, Elena opened a large wardrobe that Lyra hadn't noticed before. "Fortunately, I took the liberty of having some things brought up. We're nearly the same size, and I think these will serve much better." The gowns Elena revealed were simpler than Lady Cordelia's offerings, but infinitely more beautiful. They were clearly expensive. The fabrics alone probably cost more than Lyra had ever owned, but they were also elegant, without being ostentatious, sophisticated without being intimidating. "Elena, I can't accept these," Lyra protested. "They're too fine, too valuable. I wouldn't even know how to wear them properly." "Nonsense," Elena said briskly. "They're gifts between family members, which makes them appropriate and necessary. And as for wearing them," she studied Lyra's face thoughtfully. "You have excellent bone structure and natural grace. The rest is just a matter of confidence." Over the next few hours, Elena proved to be an invaluable guide to the mysteries of court dress and behavior. She helped Lyra choose a gown in deep forest green that complemented her dark hair and fair skin, then patiently demonstrated the proper way to move in the more formal clothing. "The key," Elena explained as she arranged Lyra's hair in an elegant style that was both sophisticated and natural, "is to remember that you belong here now, not because someone granted you permission, but because you earned your place through courage and compassion. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." As the appointed hour approached, Lyra found herself standing before a mirror, barely recognizing the woman who stared back at her. The transformation was remarkable, not just the expensive gown and carefully arranged hair, but something deeper. For the first time in her life, she looked like someone who mattered, someone who deserved respect and consideration. "Beautiful," Elena said with satisfaction. "Alden won't know what hit him." Before Lyra could protest that observation, another knock came at the door. This time, it was a young page in royal livery. "Your Grace," he said with a respectful bow. "His Majesty requests your presence in the private dining hall." The walk to dinner felt both too long and too short. Too long because Lyra's nerves wound tighter with each step. Too short because she wasn't sure she was ready for whatever awaited her. The private dining hall turned out to be far more intimate than she had expected, with seating for perhaps a dozen people rather than the hundreds she had imagined. King Alden was already there, dressed in formal but relatively simple clothing that somehow made him even more impressive than his traveling gear had. When he saw her enter, his expression shifted to something that made her pulse race. "Lyra," he said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "You look magnificent." "Thank you," she managed, though her voice sounded breathless even to her own ears. Kieran was there too, now in human form, and wearing clothes that actually fit his apparently accelerated growth. He looked like a boy of perhaps 8 or 9, rather than the toddler he had appeared to be that morning, and his golden eyes sparkled with obvious delight at seeing them together. "Father's been nervous all afternoon," he announced cheerfully, ignoring his father's warning look. He changed clothes 3 times and asked the kitchen to prepare all of Mother's favorite dishes, even though he's never done that before. "Kieran," the king said in a tone that was both fond and exasperated, "perhaps we could discuss my wardrobe choices later." "I think it's sweet," Lyra said, before she could stop herself, then immediately blushed at her own boldness. But instead of taking offense, King Alden smiled, not the formal expression she had seen him wear in public, but something warmer and more genuine. "Then perhaps my son's embarrassing honesty serves a purpose after all." The dinner that followed was unlike anything Lyra had ever experienced, not because of the food, though it was exceptional, but because of the company. For the first time in her life, she was part of a family conversation. Teasing, laughter, stories shared over good food and better wine. King Alden, she discovered, was nothing like the distant, intimidating figure she had expected. In private, he was warm, intelligent, and surprisingly funny. He told stories of Kieran's earlier adventures that made them all laugh, asked thoughtful questions about her life before the fortress, and listened to her answers as if they truly mattered to him. But it was the way he looked at her that made her breath catch. There was interest there, attraction, something that went far beyond duty or political necessity. When their eyes met across the table, she felt that same electric connection she had experienced when she touched his arm outside her cottage. "Tell me," he said, as the meal wound down and Kieran dozed contentedly in his chair. "What did you think of us when we first arrived at your village? 100 armed strangers appearing in the middle of the night. It must have been terrifying." "It was," Lyra admitted, "but not for the reasons you might think. I was terrified that I had done something wrong, that saving Kieran might somehow bring harm to him or to you. The idea that my actions might have negative consequences for someone I cared about. That was much worse than any fear for my own safety." Something shifted in King Alden's expression, a warmth that seemed to reach out across the space between them. "You cared about him already, even though you'd only just met him." "I've always been drawn to lost things," Lyra said softly. "Injured animals, abandoned objects, people who seemed alone or forgotten. Maybe because I understood how they felt. And now?" His voice was gentle, but there was an intensity underneath that made her heart race. "Do you still feel lost?" Lyra looked around the elegant dining room, then at Kieran sleeping peacefully in his chair, then finally back at the man who had become the center of her rapidly changing world. "No," she said honestly. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I might actually belong somewhere." The smile that crossed King Alden's face was brilliant enough to take her breath away. "Good," he said simply, "because I find myself hoping very much that you'll want to stay." Later, as Elena helped her prepare for bed, Lyra found herself replaying every moment of the evening. The way the king had laughed at her stories, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the careful way he had helped her navigate the social complexities of court dining. "He's falling in love with you," Elena said matter-of-factly, as she helped Lyra out of the elegant gown. "Don't be ridiculous," Lyra protested, though her heart raced at the suggestion. "We barely know each other. He's a king and I'm nobody special." "You saved his son's life," Elena reminded her. "You created a blood bond that made you part of his family. You walked into his fortress with nothing but courage and compassion, and somehow managed to charm both the crown prince and the king himself in the space of a single day." She smiled knowingly. "Trust me, dear, you're far from nobody." As Lyra settled into the most comfortable bed she had ever experienced, she allowed herself to wonder if Elena might be right. The way King Alden had looked at her, the careful attention he had paid to her comfort, the obvious effort he had put into making the evening special, it all suggested something deeper than mere duty or gratitude. But more than that was the way she felt when she was with him. Safe, valued, interesting, all things she had never experienced before. When he smiled at her, when their hands accidentally brushed as they reached for the same dish, when he listened to her stories with genuine interest, she felt like the most important person in the world. It was dangerous, she knew. Kings didn't marry rescued Omegas, no matter how many blood bonds or noble titles might be involved. But as she drifted toward sleep in her magnificent new bed, surrounded by luxury she had never imagined, Lyra found herself hoping that maybe, just maybe, this particular king might be different. Outside her windows, snow began to fall over the northern fortress, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of wolves howling, not in challenge or territorial display, but in harmony, the sound of a pack calling to each other across the darkness, promising protection, and belonging to all who answered. For the first time in her life, Lyra fell asleep, knowing that if she howled back, she would not be alone. The next morning brought new challenges and unexpected revelations. Lyra awakened to find Kieran curled up in wolf form at the foot of her bed, apparently having wandered in during the night seeking comfort from their blood bond connection. "Good morning, little prince," she murmured, scratching behind his ears in the way that made him practically purr with contentment. "Good morning, mother," he replied, shifting to human form with the casual ease of someone far older than his apparent years. "Father wants to see you after breakfast. He says there are things you need to know about your new position and about the enemies who tried to kill me." The reminder of the danger that had brought them together sobered Lyra's mood. In the comfort and luxury of the fortress, it was easy to forget that there were people out there who wanted to harm this extraordinary child, people who would undoubtedly see her as either an obstacle or a tool in their plans. "What kind of enemies?" she asked, as she helped Kieran dress for the day. "The kind who believe that royal bloodlines should be pure," Kieran said with a matter-of-factness that was chilling in someone so young. "The kind who think that anyone not born to nobility is inferior and dangerous. They tried to kill me not just because I'm father's heir, but because they want to force him to remarry and produce what they consider a more suitable replacement." The implications hit Lyra like cold water. "They'll see me as a threat too, won't they? Not just because of our bond, but because of whatever they think might be developing between your father and me." Kieran's golden eyes met hers with ancient wisdom. "Yes," he said simply, "which is why Father wants to make sure you understand what you're facing. Knowledge is the best protection we can give you." An hour later, Lyra found herself in King Alden's private study, a room that managed to be both impressive and comfortable. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, maps covered a large table, and the morning light streaming through tall windows illuminated the controlled chaos of someone who worked hard and cared deeply about his responsibilities. The king himself stood with his back to her, looking out at the mountain vista, and something in his posture suggested he was struggling with whatever he needed to tell her. "Good morning, Your Majesty," she said softly. He turned, and the smile that crossed his face was warm enough to melt winter. "Alden," he corrected gently. "When we're alone, I'm simply Alden. The crown is heavy enough without wearing it in private as well." The informality was both thrilling and terrifying. "Alden," she repeated, tasting his name on her tongue. "Better," he said with satisfaction. Then his expression grew serious. "Lyra, we need to discuss the Shadowmere Pack and what their attack on Kieran means for all of us, including you." Over the next hour, he painted a picture of court politics and ancient prejudices that made Lyra's blood run cold. The Shadowmere Pack was one of several noble families who believed that the royal bloodline had been weakened by King Alden's refusal to remarry after his mate's death. They wanted him to choose a bride from among their daughters, cementing political alliances and ensuring that the next generation of royalty would be born from appropriate bloodlines. "They see Kieran as an obstacle to those plans," Alden explained, his voice tight with controlled fury. "As long as he lives, I have an heir, which reduces the pressure for me to remarry for political purposes. But if something were to happen to him, you'd be forced to choose a new mate for the good of the kingdom," Lyra finished, understanding the horrific calculation behind the attack on an innocent child. "Exactly. And now that you're in the picture, connected to Kieran through the blood bond and clearly—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Clearly important to both of us, you represent an even greater threat to their plans. Because if you care about me, you're even less likely to marry someone they choose," Lyra said quietly. The way Alden's eyes met hers when she said that made her pulse race. "Among other reasons," he said softly. Before she could ask what other reasons he meant, a sharp knock interrupted them. Lady Cordelia entered without waiting for permission, her face flushed with what looked like barely controlled panic. "Your Majesty," she said urgently, "forgive the intrusion, but there are riders approaching under a flag of truce. Lord Shadowmere himself, along with a significant escort." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. King Alden's expression went cold and dangerous in a way that reminded Lyra exactly who and what he was. Not just a kind man who had shown her unexpected gentleness, but the most powerful alpha alive, someone who could and would destroy anyone who threatened his family. How significant? He asked in a voice that could cut glass. 50 mounted warriors, sire. All in battle gear, though they're flying the white banner and have sent word that they come to negotiate. Negotiate, Alden repeated with deadly calm. After attempting to murder my son, they want to negotiate. What do we do? Lyra asked, though part of her was terrified to know the answer. Alden's golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that took her breath away. We show them exactly what they're dealing with, he said, and we make it clear that threatening my family, any member of my family, comes with consequences they won't survive. As preparations began for what promised to be a confrontation that would determine the future of the kingdom, Lyra realized that her new life was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The blood bond that had saved Kieran's life had also thrust her into the center of a conflict that could reshape the balance of power in the north. But as she watched King Alden transform from gentle companion to royal predator, as she felt Kieran's hand slip into hers with absolute trust in her ability to protect him, Lyra discovered something surprising about herself. She was ready to fight for this family she had never expected to find, and she was willing to do whatever it took to keep them safe. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.